Writing is not what follows research, learning, or studying. It is the medium of all this work. That's a quote from the book How to Take Smart Notes by Sönke. I might have mispronounced that. But it's a very interesting idea, and it's very nuanced, especially if your traditional way of learning is simply sort of reading in bulk and then writing down notes, which are basically just quotations from the text, and then hoping that eventually it sinks into your brain. It's sort of a very brute force method of learning where you just try to cram in as much information in a short period of time and just try and remember that. And that style of learning is usually what happens at school when you have tests to do, where the objective of your reading is not necessarily to retain the information in the long term, but rather just to have enough in short-term memory in order to regurgitate information on the test and pass the test. Whereas this form of studying, where writing is treated not as something that follows research or learning or study, like in writing a final essay, things of that nature, but rather it being the medium by which you study, by which you learn, it sort of puts a twist on the whole studying process, because what it means is that at every stage of your learning process, you're going to be writing. And I think it's very helpful because writing makes you do a couple of things. The first one is it forces you to pause, and it forces you to think immediately. So for example, let's say I'm reading a biology textbook and I come across an important piece of information that stands out to me. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, whatever it is. Treating writing as the medium of learning means that in order for you to keep that piece of information in your brain, you have to write about it, which means that you have to pause, think, and then jot down a note of some sort. And to do that through the whole process means that by the end of your reading or learning period, you have accumulated a lot of written information. You've thought deeply about each of the information that you've written about, and you have all of that information ready when you have to now go and write a final paper or something of that nature. And so it's a very interesting idea. It's a very cool idea. It ties into another concept that's brought up in the book, which is the idea that ideas themselves are not very reliable. And so, for example, if you are, let's say, an aspiring fiction author, and you have a very cool story in your head, and you believe that that story is concrete, maybe not all the details are fleshed out, but you feel that you have the story in your mind, and maybe you're even afraid to write it down because somebody might read it, somebody might steal it. What this suggests is that if you don't write it down, then the idea itself is not as concrete as you imagine it to be. So the ideas you have in your brain are sort of amorphous. They don't have a shape to them until it's defined in writing and actually expressed. And it doesn't say this explicitly in the book, but the way I like to think about it is words. We think about using words in sentences all of the time, but when we actually try to speak, a lot of us have pauses, those sorts of things, and it's because intuitively we have a sense of what we want to say, but the idea itself is not yet concrete. It's amorphous. It has no shape to it. And so when you try to say it, say the words, sentences you're having in your brain, there's a gap between what you want to say and then the actual concrete idea. And so all of that is to say that treating writing as the medium of learning, I personally think, is a very useful idea, because it forces you to actually process the information that is otherwise not fully formed, amorphous, without a shape, and that is not dedicated to long-term memory. But once you force yourself to process an idea, now that idea, in my experience, sticks with you longer, because you've dedicated time and effort to actually trying to understand it fully. In addition to that, I just want to relate to final points that the book makes. And by the way, all of this is it's literally, my notes here is page 1 to 3. These ideas are in the first 3 pages of the book, so it's I haven't finished the book, but so far it's looking to be very promising, and I'm enjoying reading it. But the final idea I wanted to connect to is the idea of the final paper. So the book makes the statement that getting something that is already written into another written piece is easier than assembling everything in your mind and then trying to receive it later. So the idea is that if you have something like a final paper, it's much easier to assemble a final paper from smaller written pieces you've written beforehand, as opposed to staring at a blank page and then trying to come up with ideas to put on that page, right? And it's another interesting idea, because it suggests that the point we think is the starting point of writing, but in this case, the blank paper, the final written work, that is not actually the starting point, and that the starting point is much, much earlier. And the starting point is those sort of little pieces that you're putting in, written pieces that you're putting in, before you actually get to the point that you have to assemble that information. And it's a useful idea because it suggests that if you do treat writing as the medium of thinking of learning, by the time you have to do something like write a paper, assemble a large piece of information, you already have the parts, the bits and pieces, and all you have to do is just put it together and then sort of smooth it out, versus you having to come up with all these ideas on the spot when it's at the final paper. And so it's useful in terms of writing, but it's also useful if you abstract it, because what it suggests in a larger scale is that a lot of our final it's just that a lot of our starting points should not actually be starting points. Then our starting point should be much earlier than when we do start. So for example, let's take physical fitness. If you want to look good aesthetically, physically, then that shouldn't be the starting point, right? The starting point should be, let's say, going to the gym, or at least exercising consistently in bite-sized pieces, accumulating over time, until eventually you develop an aesthetic physique, right? Other places that it applies, maybe you have a startup. Perhaps the starting point is not when you finally get the idea for the whole startup. Maybe the starting point is just researching areas of interest, diving a little bit deeper to concepts that are troubling other people, or concepts that you might be interested, like machine learning, whatever it might be, and then sort of just accumulating these bits and pieces, so that when you're at a point where let's say you have a genuine idea for a business, a startup, you have all the accumulated points to then assemble it into something. And so, for example, let's say right now you know that you want to create a startup, you want to be a business entrepreneur, but you don't have any ideas to do anything. But let's say generally you think that it's going to be a tech startup, right? So what you could do in the current moment is to start learning programming. Just bits and pieces, see where your interests lie, and then maybe it takes you a long time. Maybe it takes you 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. But by the time you get the idea, because you spent all this time sort of bite-sized pieces putting things together, now you have the tech skill to actually implement the idea that you have later on. And so overall, it's a very interesting concept because it can be applied to other parts in life, because it's a simple question of asking yourself, what if your current starting point is actually supposed to be your end point, and that your genuine starting point should be much smaller, much earlier, and in sort of bite-sized pieces. Yeah. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. I've just started reading How to Take Smart Notes by Aaron Sönke. I hope I'm saying that right. Yeah, and so if you'd like more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel, leave a like for the video. In the future, I'm going to aim to create a higher quantity of videos as opposed to a higher quality of videos, but I'll explain my philosophy behind that in the future. But all of that is to say that in the upcoming short term, expect to get not a lot, but as many videos as I can produce, but don't expect them to be high quality. But hopefully, as I produce more and more, the videos are going to increase in quality, and that's what I hope to do in the future going on. So, if you're interested in that, then subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.